Shana Tova, and welcome to my dear friend and colleague, Janu Mendel. Janu is the South Florida Executive Director of Repair of the World, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to making community service a defining part of American Jewish life by mobilizing Jews of all ages and backgrounds, although mostly young, to serve with integrity and authenticity to leave this world a better place. Prior to Repair the World, Janu worked closely with me at the University of Miami Hillel, overseeing student engagement on campus. Janu also currently serves on the National Board of Jews of Color. He was born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica, and he's married to Lexi. Janu is a dear soul committed to our Jewish community and civic engagement. He's my dear friend too, and I'm so thrilled to be able to speak with him about a topic that really, Janu, I'm not sure we've ever had a chance to talk about before, whether we never thought it relevant or whether you were uncomfortable or I was uncomfortable speaking about it, and that is Jews of color. So thank you for being with us today. And we're just going to have a little conversation. What do you think of that?
I think that's great. And I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited to have a discussion.
Great. I'm looking forward to it too. So before we begin, on these days of the Yamim Noraim, we are instructed to take a good, long, hard look at our behavior to see what needs correcting. We call it cheshbon hanefesh, where we may have veered off track, when we may have hurt someone, whether purposely or inadvertently, you know the drill, so that we can, go ahead and make them right again. And this reflection is something that we must do not only on a personal level, but also on a communal level as well. And it is here that I want to address a form of discrimination that we are now only beginning to talk about. And that has to do with Jews of color. And some of you may be saying, what? There are Jews of color? Aren't we all white Ashkenazi from Eastern European descent? So I think our purpose today is to dispel that myth, to acknowledge our diverse and broader Jewish community, to see maybe how our ignorance and our white privilege has manifested itself actually within our Jewish community. And what do we need to do to correct it? Sound like a good plan?
I mean, I could not have outlined that better myself. I think that's a beautiful format, and I so appreciate you opening this space for us to be able to talk about this.
Well, hopefully this is only the beginning of a conversation, and it is kind of strange that we never talked about it. We worked together so intimately for so many years, and I don't know, never thought about talking to you about what it meant for you. So let's begin. Who are Jews of color? How many are we talking about?
So, I mean, I'll say simply put, Jews of color are those who are not necessarily from what we, in our minds, especially in the United States, consider as white Jews of Ashkenazi descent. So this might be Jews who are Black, Jews who are descended from other ethnic groups, Sephardi Mizrahi, Jews from East Asia, Jews by choice, Jews from Africa, anyone who doesn't fit within that neat, homogeneous white American Jew, New York deli style thinking that we usually think about when we refer to American Jews.
I mean, is it like one or two? Like, how many are we talking about? I mean, is this something that is a growing group of our Jewish community? Has it always been, I mean, what are we talking here? Why is this all of a sudden an important issue that we need to be discussing?
Right. Well, I'll say that Jews of color have always existed. And it's interesting to think about why in a place like the United States, it feels like for the first time, many people are having this discussion or having this realization. But, if you think back to the long history of Jews over thousands of years, right? Or just humanity in general, coming out of the cradle of Africa, settling in the Middle East. If you think about the 12 lost tribes and where they settled further south back in Africa and going as far east as, China and India, over the course of thousands of years, we understand that Jews who are not a race, right, but we are way more complex in terms of, our ethnic background or religious beliefs and all the other things that make us Jewish separate from race. It would so then follow that you can find Jews descended of our tradition in every corner of the globe, especially, you know, we talk about that in our own tradition, right? So I, for example, was born and raised in Jamaica, and I have now in the world of, you know, Jewish professional life encountered and met so many Jews who are here in America. And recent studies actually put the American Jews of color community at around 12 to 15% of the American Jewish community. And based on the most recent numbers, that, you know, we're talking about almost 1 million Jews of color in America.
It's just, it's unbelievable to me. It's like they're hiding under a rock, or we're, you know, not seeing them. You know, that's the other piece of it is, you know, are they, you know, not visible to us because we don't acknowledge that in fact they exist. I think that there's a conflict with the percentage though, because I think that E-Jewish Philanthropy came out with that 12 to 15% of American Jewry, but the more recent Pew study puts it at more like a 6 to 7%. But even still, that's still, you know, a pretty huge number. And so,
Right, and I think, go ahead.
yeah.
No, I was saying I'm familiar with, I think, that recent conjecture. I think the Pew study is the one, I believe, that came out in 2003, if I'm not mistaken. And this other study, which was actually, you know, spearheaded by the Jews of Color Initiative, came a little bit later and used some of the data from the Pew study. So, you know, I think it's less about determining like whether the number is 6 or whether the number is more. I think the concept behind the study that put it at 12 to 15% used the Pew and other studies to show how, based on the statistics and the questions asked, studies about American Jewry have undercounted Jews of color potentially for many years.
So somewhere there's still a significant number.
Indeed.
You started telling us about your family background, that you were born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica. And I felt a little funny asking you this question, whether it's even okay to ask you about your family history. Is it okay to ask people, you know, when you find out that they are Jewish? Like, is it disrespectful to say, like, you wouldn't necessarily ask me if you found out I was Jewish? Oh, really? Where are you from? Like, in a query, like, validating way. So is it okay to ask you that question? Do you feel put off by that question?
Right. And, you know, I think in your statement about not being asked that question when you know, come into a Jewish space, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. And the answer is that there is not necessarily any right answer. Usually it is best to err on the side of not asking, right? Because trying to gatekeep or query someone's Jewish background when they're coming into a Jewish space is not necessarily the right way to go, because it could potentially cause some harm. It could impact the person, even if the intention was just genuine curiosity. Oh, you know, where does your family come from? Like, how is it that you're Jewish? But because there is kind of this disparity in which that wouldn't happen to someone who presents like a more often thought of white Ashkenazi Jew, it's probably best not to ask that question. And maybe as you build a relationship with this person, you will then, you know, learn more about them. They may open themselves up to discussion. And, you know, like myself today, like I'm coming into this, you know, excited and happy to share my story. But on another day, showing up to pray in a synagogue, maybe I wouldn't be so excited to share.
Okay, so since we have a relationship, and since we're both trusting of each other, and you know the intent with which I'm asking, can you tell us about your family history, and how is it that your family, I mean, if you even know what the history is of your family in terms of their Jewish roots?
Sure. So I am a mixed race Jew, and funnily enough, my father is of Ashkenazi descent. So my father moved, he was born in Romania, his family emigrated to Israel, and just by, you know, happenstance, he ended up in Jamaica. My mother is Black and Indian. They met, and I was born and raised as a patrilineal Jew. And I think I represent, you know, a growing number of Jews, especially in this country, who are products of interracial marriages. There are, you know, also Black Jews of like long tradition and history who are not from intermarried. So I think there's also an importance in not making an assumption that a Jew of color is either a Jew by choice or from an intermarried family. I personally happen to be so. And I can tell you that I've encountered a lot of uncomfortable conversations in describing my Jewish descent and having my Jewish authenticity or validity questioned, even though I work full-time as a Jewish professional. And I think that's something that a lot of Jews who are in my situation encounter, especially when it's in the reverse, where, you know, maybe the person's mother is Jewish, but they're in an interracial, you know, marriage or the product of an interracial marriage, and then are made to feel less than or not as welcome in Jewish spaces. And then as a result, maybe don't participate as much, which is one piece of why maybe we just don't know that many in our community. And it's not that they don't exist.
They're flying under the radar. We've made them invisible because we ask questions or make assumptions about them that makes them feel not welcomed or not a part of, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. And it varies from the very seemingly okay, oh, you know, like I haven't seen you before, or maybe you don't quite look like you belong. And sometimes veers on the opposite end of, instead of being greeted by someone from the congregation, they're greeted by the security guard to find out, you know, why they're there.
Is just, that kills me. So sometimes we discriminate and we don't even know that we're doing that, because it is, as you said before, you know, kind of just glossed over, and with good intent, just out of curiosity, wanting to understand, because we, for some reason, are so white-centric in our country, and that has made its way into our Jewish community as well, in terms of our white privilege and stuff. You mentioned that you, you know, I guess because we, you know, inadvertently do this, but you mentioned that you have been the recipient of some questioning the validity of your Jewish heritage. Can you share with us an example or two of what you're talking about?
Sure. I mean, I certainly have come into Jewish spaces, whether they are synagogues or otherwise. And when, you know, depending on how much I've been to the beach that weekend, like the level of suntan that maybe I'm exhibiting, people, you know, will be curious and they're like, oh, you know, where are you from? You know, are you from around here? Are you from Miami? You know, where did you move from? As soon as I start speaking and I have an accent that isn't an American accent, people, you know, sometimes excitedly, but sometimes very questioningly, just, you know, kind of want to know why I'm there. And while I'll say in my experience, it has mostly been decipherable as coming from a place of just genuine curiosity. You know, when you speak of kind of discrimination that Jews of color may face, that comes in many forms. And I think that kind of questioning, while it may seem so small, it's, you know, referred to in racial justice work as microaggressions. And it is just kind of a small, slight, you know, whether it's a question or a small comment or, you know, oh, wow, you know, you're so exotic, or I didn't know that there were Jews in Jamaica. It usually comes from like a good place, but not always. But hearing that repeatedly for someone who is just seeking a sense of belonging in the community eventually becomes, you know, possibly tiresome. And it's, I think it's one of the contributing factors that keeps people away. Not to mention my personal experience as, you know, I mentioned I was a patrilineal Jew. I have encountered many instances of being dismissed outright by folks whose first question usually is, well, is your mother Jewish? Because you don't look like the typical Jew. Is your mother Jewish? And when the answer for me is no, you know, even though I was raised as a Jew, even though I had a bar mitzvah, even though I work as a Jewish professional, those things aren't enough for some in the community, which, you know, it's heartbreaking sometimes.
Yeah. So that probably, that crosses over racial lines too. That happens for purely white, you know, white skinned people who find that too, who are a product of intermarriage, interfaith.
Totally.
You may not have experienced it, but are there other things that you know from your reading and from your discussions with other Jews of color of how our Jewish community has discriminated against, you know, part of our Jewish community, our Jews of color?
So it varies from, you know, the examples that, you know, I brought up earlier around like microaggressions. It comes to maybe somewhere in the middle where there's a recognition that a few Jews of color exist and maybe made to feel tokenized by, the community that they're in. Sometimes what that looks like is asking them to, be the one, person of color on a panel to speak exclusively to the plight of all people of color in the community or in the country.
Today.
which to your credit, you're not doing with me today, right? So I'm so happy that I'm here to talk about my personal experience. I for sure don't, prescribe to speak of all JOC in America. I'm not a representative of all JOC in America. But I can tell you, like, instances that I've heard of from friends. I have a good friend who is a Black Jew who was accosted in Brooklyn, for example, because he was walking with a Torah and people thought he was stealing it. And it became a whole thing where the police were called. And, in the climate that we're in today, we know very well what can happen when the police are called, and the person that is being called upon is a Black man. So these are things that our Jewish brothers and sisters experience every day. And I encourage people listening to think about it as our community, right? It's not an us versus them. This is something, we might get into later, but, we often talk about kind of, the Jewish community and the Black community and how our communities can work together. But, speaking in that way almost inadvertently erases the existence of Black Jews who are both Jewish and inhabit Black bodies.
Yeah. So that is something I'd like to talk about, because maybe there is some way for us, because we have always been at the forefront of Black Jewish relations. And it's interesting, this dichotomy of why we're at this juncture within our own community of taking a good hard look at who we are and how we have discriminated within our own community, although we've been at the forefront of Black Jewish relations for decades, beginning, well, not beginning with, but certainly highlighting Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King Jr. In their civil rights work. From what I understand, when I was doing some research, I found that there are different things that actually mirror racial discrimination issues within our community as well. Things like job advancement within our Jewish community. So it's, and you can speak to the fact that you are actually the executive director of an important Jewish organization within our community. So that's, one way. I think the others that I've seen is that they're not included in communal shots of, PR pieces. So we'll see pictures of lots of white happy faces, but we don't see Jews of color when we're taking a snapshot for promotional purposes in different organizations of Jews of color. They're also not sitting at the table when we're trying to figure out what does the 21st century Jewish community look like and how are we projecting it. We don't seem to be dedicating our time, or we haven't up until now, dedicated our time to focusing on how the Jews of color can also be included in our story and in our planning and in our rhetoric. A lot of that visioning that we need to be doing today. I think that, those are some of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of how we as on a national level also need to be focusing on how to bring this into the forefront of our conversations, bringing it to the table of lots of levels of Jewish communal planning.
Right. I mean, I'm so glad that you raised that because, not just in the recent studies on, Jewish demographics, but the demographics of our country are pointing towards increased incidences of a diverse growing America, right? So as each generation passes and the younger generations are coming up, we're looking at more diverse, more people of color, more families that have at least one person of color in that family unit. And it's, as a country, we're trending that way. And so the same is true in the Jewish community. So I think anyone who is not now, especially now, right, with everything going on in the country, anyone who is not thinking about how to include Jews of color as part of our communities in the right way would be missing the 8 ball, or like missing a really great opportunity to get ahead of the curve in a place that we've fallen behind in the past, right? So examples kind of related to what you just mentioned are what might often happen is that a mostly white committee will come up with a statement around diversity and inclusion, and then ask the one Jew of color that they know to like sign off on it. Like, is this okay? Like, did we miss anything? But maybe one would ask why that, you know, Jew of color or more Jews of color in the community weren't part of the committee that wrote the letter itself, and not just asked for like the sign off after, right? So there is kind of a track and a move that you want to look for to be truly inclusive and to not risk tokenizing, you know, people that we have in our community.
Right, and it probably also speaks to the idea that if they have felt marginalized and invisible, if you will, in our community, then they don't find a place for themselves in our community. And so, you know, just like we're reaching out in a strong way to the LGBTQ plus community, you know, we probably need a, you know, big concerted effort towards welcoming in Jews of color after all these years and including them, a special, you know, like welcome mat that needs to be loud and clear, that we are only complete when we can include everybody who's a Jew at the table within our community. And this, by the way, will really impact my own synagogue community, because although we hadn't up until recently had any Jews of color in our particular community, one of our congregants' daughters just adopted a little baby who is of color. And so now all of a sudden we have that within our community. And I think that's only the very beginning of including, you know, growing, seeing a difference of, you know, what we all look like, and seeing it differently, seeing us that we aren't of one ethnic background. We are not one of one country of origin. We don't even necessarily speak the same language.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have the same color, eyes, hair, skin. So
Yeah,
so these are
you're
different
so
things,
right.
and I think that we'll be, you know, that we will be seeing more of it, even if we haven't up until now.
Right, you know, because it's one of those things where I hope upon hearing, you know, this discussion, people might say, you know, that's not so much of a stretch. That, you know, that explanation, that story makes sense. And maybe, you know, because of just how American life in general centers the white experience, we have, you know, encountered that similarly in our Jewish communities, and have failed to remember that there has always been a diverse amount of Jews. We have always looked many different ways. We have never been a monolith in our entire history.
Do you remember, I forgot the name of it right now, but there, I think we discussed this at some point, that there was a Jewish rapper who did this thing, who was a Jew. Remember, didn't we talk about that at some point?
I,
He was at Hillel conference with us.
I think so. Is
Um,
it,
so
it's, I,
it'll come to us, but I know that, you know, it's
yes.
like, what do they look like? What do they, you know, and it's like, who's a Jew? I mean, that was a discussion when I was growing up as a little kid, and I still don't remember talking about Jews of color. And even though we, you know, have been trying to broaden our definition, sense of identity, but we haven't up until now with regard to this. You know, Johnny, I was wondering, because it could be coincidental or not, that you have found your way after a stint in real estate, which I didn't discuss, finding your way into the Jewish community. First of all, with Hillel, and now as the executive director of Repair the World in South Florida. Are you a product of your upbringing? And how or why? Like, give us a sense of that.
I mean, I would say yes. I was raised in a synagogue that looked very diverse, right? That was filled with mixed race Jews, that was filled with Black Jews. And when I first moved here and I started to find my home in the Jewish community, it was like finding something similar, but in a strange land, right? So I had to learn a lot for the first time, you know, Ashkenazi tunes to singing in synagogue, right? Things that I didn't necessarily grow up with. And while there is enough within Judaism to kind of feel at home, even in a different community, it was always as if like there was something missing, and it didn't accurately reflect what I grew up with. And I think once I was lucky enough to find a community that raised and amplified experiences for Jews of color in the United States, I started to then meet other Caribbean Jews who looked like me in skin tone, Jews whose parents had similar stories. And it became just a really beautiful addition to my American Jewish story. And now more than ever, I feel so at home as an American Jew because I'm in spaces that work consistently day after day to include Jews of color and to raise awareness about Jews of color, and to make sure that we are doing as much as we can to like help everyone see that it's a real thing.
I guess in some way, whether you planned it or not, you've become a poster child for it. But you are very approachable, you're warm, you are accomplished, and so it enables people to learn from your experience and from what you are able to impart. And I know this is just the beginning, but there's a reason why you are following this path. You're meant to be a teacher and a leader among our Jewish community, so that you can show us and demonstrate for us how we can be better. This whole cheshbon hanefesh that we're supposed to be doing in this month of Elul, and means that we need to often take a hard look at how we ourselves and we as a community have done wrong by people, because our Jewish community is all about communal relationships, and we've fallen short. So we need to be opened up, and we don't ever, at Passover we say, the one who doesn't even know the questions to ask. We're sort of at that stage of just trying to figure out, like, wait a minute, how are we discriminating? Oh, that's discrimination. Like when we were discussing when George Floyd situation came upon us, all of a sudden we were talking white privilege, and we're like, oh, I mean, I'm discriminating and I'm a product of deepening the divide, racial divide, because of who I am, and I didn't even know it. I didn't know it, or I didn't pay attention to it. And I'm so happy in a way that this has all come to the forefront. And during our COVID situation, it's given us a time to step back and reflect on who we are, and more importantly, on who we want to be.
Right. I mean, I love that. I think that's just such an incredible way to look at it. It's hard to have this conversation sometimes. It's hard for people to think, after living a life is in what their minds has been a great life as a really good person, to then hear, wait, there are these things. What is this, white privilege, and I think, being able to stop for a moment and listen to stories of other people, and to understand that, not knowing doesn't make you a bad person. And it's what you will now do now that you do know, that will dictate kind of what comes next. And we all have the opportunity to constantly grow and learn every day. I mean, we read our Torah in cycles year after year with the intent of continuing to learn, because our learning is never complete, right? So the same should be true in every aspect of life.
Well, hopefully this is only the beginning of the discussion, and we can share this with the world so that we can inform and educate it and lift up this conversation, so that less people can feel uncomfortable, and more importantly, so more people can be welcomed and included in our Jewish community that haven't historically been welcomed. And I guess with that, I'd love to ask you, like, what can we do? Like, what are some best practices that are beginning to percolate in our Jewish community, maybe in different places around the country, in terms of us welcoming Jews of color, in terms of us changing our policies and our systemic, discrimination that apparently we are engaged in, and how we can be less judgmental. One of the things I just want to say before you answer this question is, like, I remember growing up as a kid, there was something about marrying a Black person, like in the Jewish community. Like, that was just not, forget if they were Jewish, it still wasn't like good enough. It was so steeped in our psyche that we have to undo lots of years of white privilege that we had no right to claim, because we were immigrants coming from, you know, far off parts of Eastern Europe, and all of a sudden we rode the coattails of, you know, white Christian privilege. And we forgot, we as a community forgot that we are strangers ourselves. We are the other. We can't ever be that to other people. We can't do that to other people. So anyway, so that's what I wanted to just like see, what are the different things that we could be doing that could enhance our work in terms of welcoming and breaking down barriers.
Right. I mean, I think there are a variety of things, and it's not kind of a one fix for all, and every community will look different. But I think really working on building relationships with the Jews of color who live in your community, seeking them out, making sure they know that they're welcome, you know, past this, you know, we'd love them to be in a picture, or we'd love them to sign off on something, or to sit on a panel one time. But, you know, spending time, you know, having the coffee dates, meeting their families, like understanding who our community is and why they're welcome. I think there is a big piece around relationship building, the same way we would to any new member of our community that moved in from out of town or somewhere else, right? I think a good rule of thumb is, you know, asking, would I do this same thing, ... if it was a white presenting Jew? And if the answer is no, then maybe not doing those things. And this is a little bit more difficult because it takes some like active restraint, right? So things like, you know, asking someone new where they are and or where they're from and what their background is, and you know, that story might come with time. There is an element of gatekeeping in our Jewish communities where we feel like we need to protect, and you know, we get at it. There's this like legacy, especially for, you know, Jews of European descent in America, and you know, those who fled the Holocaust. There's this, you know, element of gatekeeping, which I think now we really need to interrogate what pieces of it are still necessary and applicable in today's society, and how we are using gatekeeping as a process to exclude a Jew of color or someone who doesn't look white when they're trying to come in through the door. I made some reference earlier to this way of not tokenizing, right? How are we actually utilizing the Jews of color in our community for their experience and for their expertise, and not just their color, right? So are we asking someone to sit at the table and work on a letter because they are a Black Jew, or because we really want to utilize their law expertise, right? Or their expertise because they've been doing this work for so many years, but we also want to make sure that if there's 10 people in the room, then we want to have, you know, an accurate makeup of what we know our community looks like. So I think just kind of thinking through those things ahead of time, and, you know, not, you know, coming on the back end to say, oh, you know, we already did it, but do you think it's okay? Is, you know, usually what happens first, but you know, it's not always the right way to go about it.
So I remember when we were, one of the things that we always did in terms of programming at Hillel together was to make sure that we weren't programming from the top down. You know, that we weren't programming for people without having their voices a part of the discussion in terms of what they wanted, what they needed. So we have to get Jews of color at the table, and like in terms of what comes first, like where are they, and how do we do that? Like a banner, like, hello, Jews of color, we're welcoming, can you come to the table? Because they're not a part of it. So it has to start somewhere. So even though our rule of thumb was don't do that, maybe it is about first hanging the banner and saying, you know, all are welcome here, you know, let's have a discussion. I don't know, because you say that, but I and you might know more because you might naturally know more, but I don't know that most people have that connection or know of that many people that are Jews of color.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be for a number of reasons, because I think that Sephardic communities that tend to be of color tend to stay very tightly knit in their communities, as do white Ashkenazi Jews stay within their communities. That's because they have different traditions, different music, different ways that they commune together. So there are lots of reasons that are benign, you know. So we have to figure that out. And I'm not
Sure.
sure if we're going to answer those questions or solve the world's problems in this moment. I think it's really just about us beginning this conversation about, you know, how we need to do that, how we have been remiss, how we have discriminated, how we have been less than welcoming to a strong segment of our Jewish community. And I think it behooves us in the general Jewish community, but also within Beth and other synagogues to say, we got to talk about this. Where are they? I mean, just like I'm doing with LGBTQ community, like we're having a conversation and looking for them, putting that word out there, seeking them out. So not so they are the token ones so that we can say, oh, we're doing a good job with this,
Right.
but because we aren't complete until we can have a greater voice, a greater representation of who we are as a Jewish community. We can learn from each other, grow from each other. And I think that that's an important vision for how we can see this new 5781 in the year to come.
Yeah, you know, and I think to that point, there are, you know, maybe two ways you can look about the growth of our JOC communities and how we're welcoming JOC, right? So, you know, I'll give shout out to the fact that there are JOC-led organizations who are doing incredible work in organizing. So I, for example, found my community of JOC through a program at Bend the Arc. And Bend the Arc has a leadership program known as SELA. And 1 year understood that, okay, we're going to center Jews of color and have a Jews of color cohort. And we're able to like find brilliant Jews of color from across the country to be in this cohort. And I met some lifelong friends there, right? People who, you know, like Yavila McCoy has been organizing Jews of color since the 90s, right? So it's for sure not like a new thing by any means. Ilana Kaufman, who runs the Jews of Color Initiative, is mobilizing funds to make sure we are investing in Jews of color and the leadership of Jews of color. So April those Baskin. Networks, April Baskin, another like wonderful friend who is doing such incredible work. You know, the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable, like there are Jewish organizations, you know, and a lot of them kind of are centered in the, you know, so-called big cities, you know, New York area, Yavila is in Massachusetts, Ilana is in California, but that example will have ripple effects. And on the flip side, you know, in our tradition, we talk about saving one life. It's as if saving the entire world. And, you know, it's okay to not bind all the Jews of color in your community tomorrow. But when one does venture into the synagogue door, so to speak, what are we going to do with that one person, right? So
thank you. That was a great reminder that we can do that one by one, and that it is inevitable that we will have Jews of color, as even our small little Bethor community has found its way to having our, dare I say, our first, because that also in itself sounds a little bit too focused on, you know, like as I was saying, like, is it okay to ask that question? But maybe it will help us to highlight this particular JOC issue and help us to grow in a more organic way. And hopefully in the years to come, as you come across different projects or different people that, you know, maybe we can be collaborating together and help to bring light to this segment of our population, whether it is 15, 16%, or whether it's on the 7, 8%, it's still, we're still talking about a lot of lives that if we are talking about the value of one life and saving one life, we could be richer for this discovery. So Janu Mendel, you are a treasure to our people and you are a dear friend to me. And I am so blessed to have you share these thoughts with us and help enlighten us on a topic that I know that we all have to dive into in the year to come. So I love you, man. You
I
are
mean,
awesome.
pleasure as always. And, you know, I'm happy to come back at any point for further discussion. It's always such a blessing to be able to speak with you.
Okay, so maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll do a follow-up and we can figure out what are our next steps and how
Mm,
can we bring greater attention and love and, you know, openness to this conversation.
sounds like a good plan to me.
Oh, that would be amazing. Have a wonderful Shana Tova Umituka. It should be a sweet, good year for you and Lexi and your whole family. And I hope that we'll have many opportunities to create beautiful Jewish memories and others in the coming year.
All the same, right back to you. And thank you so much again for having me.
Mm. Mwah.